Welcome, everyone, to the 17th Annual Newburyport Literary Festival. I am Leslie Hendrickson. I'm on the steering committee of the festival. Our honoree, Kim Johnson, held leadership positions in social justice organizations as a teen. She's now a college administrator who maintains civic engagement throughout the community while also mentoring Black student activists and leaders. This Is My America is her debut novel. It explores racial injustice against Black men who are criminally sentenced and the families left to pick up the pieces. She holds degrees from the University of Oregon and the University of Maryland College Park. Kim lives her best life in Oregon with her husband and 2 kids. Find her at kcjohnsonwrites.com and follow her on Twitter and Instagram at kcjohnsonwrites. CJ Farley is the author of 5 novels, including the new young adult novel, 0 O'Clock, which he'll be talking about at the festival tomorrow at 10 a.m. So you should check out the schedule to see more of CJ. But he also has a number of nonfiction books, including Before the Legend, The Rise of Bob Marley, and the national bestseller, Aaliyah, More Than a Woman, which was adapted into a hit movie for Lifetime Television. Farley co-wrote and co-edited the book, The Blues, the companion volume to Martin Scorsese's PBS documentary series. His short fiction has been in a number of anthologies, including the Vintage Book of War Fiction. He's a graduate of Harvard and has won a number of awards, including an NAACP Image Award in 2020. 0 O'Clock is about a teenager who lives in New Rochelle, New York, and is grappling with the pandemic, and also finds herself in the Black Lives Matter movement. The Hate U Give author Angie Thomas said 0 O'Clock is insightful, eye-opening, and inventive. Thank you both so much for being here. And CJ, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thanks so much for that great introduction, and thank you to the festival organizers for making this whole event possible. I'm really psyched and excited about doing it. I loved this book. This Is My America, so it's great to talk to you about it, Kim. There's so much to talk about. I want to talk about mass incarceration. I want to talk about the death penalty. I want to talk about what it's like being a sister growing up in Oregon, and I want to talk about, there's so many things we got to get into your HBO deal, but I want to start off to set the mood. I know it's a little weird reading on Zoom sometimes, but can you read just a little bit, a 60-second clip, just give people a taste of This Is My America, just to sort of set the mood for everyone?
Great. Yeah, I'm honored to be here. Thank you so much. And I'm so excited to be here with you because we have even more connections, because the next book that's coming out for me deals with the pandemic and has a male protagonist. And so I feel like we should be swapping and sharing our work, Chris. So I'm really excited to talk with you. I'll just start from the beginning. This is a sample letter that Tracy, who's my main character in my story, writes, and then I'll read just a little bit from that first chapter that leads right into it. So this is Tracy writing to Innocence X headquarters. My dad has precisely 275 days before his execution. They're the only hope we have because every lawyer we've used has failed us. In the last appeal, Judge Williams didn't take more than 5 minutes to consider. We mailed a renewed application since it's now been 7 years. Please look into James Beaumont's application. We have the court and trial files boxed up and ready to go. P.S. Jamal's going to college. Can you believe it? All that running added up to something. If you have those letters where I say he was wasting his time, please destroy them. P.S.S. Next Saturday at 10 a.m., Jamal's doing an interview on the Susan Turk Show. You should check it out. And the first scene from the chapter, I'll just read it really briefly. It's titled Ready, Set, Go. Time runs my life, a constant measuring of what's gone and what's to come. Jamal's 100-meter dash is a blazing 10.06 seconds. That's how my older brother got his monumental interview. I'm not thinking about Jamal's record, though. I'm thinking about Daddy's time. 7 years, 2,532 days served, to be exact. This running clock above my head's been in place since his conviction. That moment branded me. Mama gripped the courtroom bench to keep from collapsing as each juror repeated guilty. I looked to Mama for an explanation. The empty look in her eye cried out the answer: death. Since then, it's TikTok.
Well, that's great. Well, thanks a lot for that. I listened to the audiobook version of your book as
Oh,
well.
well then we should have just played played Bonnie because she's so great.
Yeah, you have a legend reading it. Bonnie Turpin, she's someone who's won so many awards for narration. She really has a way of inhabiting characters and bringing books to even more life. So she's great too. If you haven't checked out the audio version, you should check out Bonnie Turpin reading her book. But it leads me to my first question, which is a question that I ask myself, and I'm hoping that maybe you have an answer to it, is why write YA? Why not write adult books? Why not write other kinds of books? What draws you to YA fiction as a way of expressing, what's in your heart?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's so many things that really draw me. The most obvious is the fact that I work in higher education. I work with young people all the time, and so I'm surrounded by them. And my purpose in my work, which I feel is connected to my writing, is to help young people actualize the opportunities for their next generation of what they want to do. Those sort of amazing things that we used to dream about when we were younger, that maybe we've been sort of beaten down by reality that we don't do that anymore. And so I really think that's why I love young adult space so much, because it's filled with so many possibilities. They take on the world in a really different way than when we're thinking about writing adult. And even though I write about honestly very complicated, sometimes painful issues, I always want to drive hope. And that's really what draws me with young people. And I guess the last thing that I'll say is that it's totally selfish, because when I was growing up and a teenager, I didn't have books with Black characters, let alone any kind of diverse characters that are written by any Black, Indigenous person of color. I didn't have that. And so I think every time I'm reading YA and writing my YA work, I feel like I'm like back to a time period that I would have loved to be in. And so I just love being in that space.
Now, one thing that goes on with me when I write is that, I have two teenage kids and their lives are so interesting. I found myself writing YA because I was fascinated by what they're going through. It's funny, before I was a writer, I used to read stories about how F. Scott Fitzgerald would steal things from Zelda Fitzgerald's diary and from her life and put it into his own work. And I found myself doing the same thing with my kids. They'd say interesting stuff. Their friends would. I'd be taking them to a basketball game and hear someone say something in the back seat and I'd put that into a book. Do you find yourself inspired in the same way by your kids and your experiences raising them?
Yeah, I mean, when I wrote my first book, my son at the time was so young. So now he's 14, and now there's all kinds of interesting things if I can get him to talk. That's one of the other challenges of having a quiet young person. But I feel like mostly the conversations that I have with students and how they're thinking and what's bothering them about the world and how they approach friendships, now how they look at me, being older, sort of that sort of engagement in conversation. I do get a feel in my writing of their voices, but I really try not to touch on like specific things that are personalities of students, other than the activism role, like that. That for Tracy, my main character, who has this very, sort of very determined and relentless. I think that really models my own experience as a someone who's very active in organizations with the young people who are like, they're not taking no for an answer. And most people find them, oh, they're so abrasive, or why won't they just, just stop and realize that we're working on these things, and they don't. And I feel like those are the pieces that I take a lot from, is that kind of energy and that kind of rebellious acts that have moved our country forward in so many different ways.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by the interplay between real life and what ends up in your fiction. And you mentioned a bit about some of your days as an activist kid. But there was a story that you told in an interview that really sort of fascinated me in terms of how it was formative for this book, where when you moved to a new place in Oregon, you had a neighbor that had a big flag out and they had a gun and things got a little ugly. Can you tell me that story? I want to hear more details about that and how that might have set the table for this book, which deals with issues of racism and inequality.
Yeah, and I think you know, that's really an example when I was even thinking about making the title "This Is My America," and I was writing at the time, and I was really sort of struggling with how to title it, and the flag. It's such a prominent thing that comes up, especially when we talk about who is American, who gets to be American, who gets to question America, who gets to have the flag in front of their house. And you know, my own experience is likely not different than many other you know, diverse folks moving into neighborhoods where they are the minority in that community. And, you know, at the time, you know, I moved from one side of town to another side of town, me and my husband, very excited to have our first home. And what we didn't notice was that our neighbor had a huge pole and a flag. And for a lot of people who love the flag and, you know, they're like, what's wrong with that? Oftentimes it's connected to a message. It's sending a certain kind of signal. Almost in the sense of thinking about the use of the Confederate flag. And not to say that the use of the flag is that. I don't have a problem with the flag. You know, I have things with the flag, you know, in them, but sometimes it's sending a different message. And so when my husband was moving our stuff into our house after we bought our house, there were, you know, questioning that the neighbor had about what he was doing, why he was moving things in, which, you know, it's such a strange dichotomy to me, is that if he was moving stuff out, maybe question, but he's actually moving stuff into a house that had a flag that was there. And just really that sort of posturing of whose neighborhood it is, and the questioning that came in a conversation that my husband had about, oh, well, this neighbor over here, you know, they're a doctor and they're a lawyer, and really sort of trying to place that we didn't belong with it. And there's more to that, you know, particular story, but it feels like it's one story of so many that occurs, and that one was just much more, you know, aggressive in the way of, you know, someone going in their house, placing a gun on the side of their house and sort of tapping it just to make sure that we knew as new neighbors coming in that he's protecting the neighborhood, protecting our own, pointing out where the security cameras are, you know, in the neighborhood, and that kind of thing. And it's that example of, you know, how people think about who is welcomed and who is not welcomed. And so much of my story when I was writing it, not that hasn't stopped, it definitely has continued in terms of our reckoning with race, especially after 2020. But a lot of this was happening in 2015. The election, the Trump election occurred. Charlottesville was happening. There was sort of larger awakening happening in this country, that even though we've always had racism, that there's a more sort of vocal nature of how it needs to be, that people need to actually move out of their way to interrupt your space in order to stop that. And so much of that really, I think, was in the background of my mind, not only in thinking about our criminal justice system, but our entire sort of ecosystem of what happens before you actually are pulled over, before you're actually stopped. Somebody called somebody to bring sort of that attention to you, and what it is about our neighbors and the people around us that still have such a fear of us when we're just living our lives.
Now, as you said, that's sort of the ecosystem, that's kind of the racist ecosystem we all kind of live in. I wonder what drew you specifically to the subject of the death penalty, because this book is about a young girl whose father is unjustly imprisoned and sitting on death row for a crime he did not commit. And I'm not going to give anything away, but other family members get caught up in similar kinds of drama, and that's kind of the launching pad for this whole plot. But what drew you to think, I need to examine the death penalty in this book?
Yeah, you know, when I first started thinking about what I really wanted to write on this topic of issues of race, that really was sort of like the bigger picture, and so much was happening around Black Lives Matter, And very, very sort of early on in that late 2014, early 2015 time period. Angie Thomas was, a lot of news was coming out about her. She was writing this book called They Hate You Give, and we didn't really know what was going to happen with that book. Jason Reynolds was writing All American Boys. And it was kind of a time period where we heard about the books, but we didn't know what those books were. And from the messages, it was really clear that it was dealing directly with issues of police brutality and sort of like that system that happens in terms of who's a suspect and who's not, and who gets to have voice. And so also, at my university and my community, a lot of the young people that I was meeting with who were either trying to get guidance on what they can do in their own community, or sort of trying to understand why these things were happening. I just kept finding it so interesting that and the media were so hyper-focused on just police brutality. Like that was the only issue that was occurring. And for me, having been involved in, my sort of first awakening with justice issues was with Rodney King, and seeing that live and happen, and feel like my shock of, oh my goodness, this really happens, and you can get away with it when it's actual, there's evidence of it. And so I went back to my core of my own research that I do, which you have it right behind you, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, the work around mass incarceration, all of those. I really go back to my studies as an ethnic studies major, focused on African-American history and politics and sociology, is that it's systemic. It isn't, it's not, you can't even if you use example of police sort of as this sort of dynamic that's occurring, and disparities between arrests within Black and brown and poor folks, it's the sentencing, right? The trial. But if you even get to a trial, because some people are so scared, even if they're innocent, that they'll claim guilty in order to get a reduced sentence. And I wanted to tell something much larger than that. And I wasn't sure how to do it, because I really wanted it to be different than what I saw was sort of coming out into the world at the time. And then I read what I consider one of my modern day heroes, and that is Bryan Stevenson's Just Mercy. And when I read his really memoir and his compassion that he has, and how he used the death penalty as our greatest injustice within our entire criminal justice system, I really started to think about, wow, how can I think about the families that are impacted and talk about a cycle that's occurring. And so really that's where the core of my story came to be, is if we can't get people on the same page about that there are injustices occurring, can we at least get on the same page that if we sentence someone to the death sentence, whether we agree with it or not, that if they actually are innocent and we put them through the death sentence and actually murder them, which is what I believe what it is, then there's something wrong with our system. And if there's something wrong with our system at the sort of greatest conviction that you can kind of get, then what else is wrong? And so that's sort of really where I thought about how to write and tell the story in the way that I told it.
Well, it's fascinating to hear about some of the source material that inspired you and some of the research that you did. But I'm also interested in what your individual, your personal contacts have been with law enforcement. And I ask that because there's a great scene in your book where the hero, Tracy, has been leading all these sort of know your rights workshops, and she's an expert in the way people should react to cops, and she teaches that to other kids and people in the community. She herself has an encounter with cops in which guns are drawn, and she realizes she can't quite hold all the stuff she's learned in her head, and she doesn't quite react the way she thought she would when confronted with it in real life. And as a journalist myself, I know I've written stories about the death penalty and juvenile offenders on death row in Louisiana back in the 90s. But I found just not that long ago, I was stopped in New Jersey for driving too slow with my family. And the cop gave me a ticket, and I felt myself so filled with such anger over this happening, and this guy talking to me this way in front of my kids. I realized it's one thing to write about these things, it's nothing to actually live it. Have you had any personal encounters with law enforcement that stoked your fires as a writer?
I think probably most closely with the people around me, like your example of being pulled over when we first moved to Oregon, and my husband was probably pulled over 6 times in the first 6 months that he moved there, and whether driving too slow, just checking, but never getting a ticket, which is always the most fascinating thing, is never getting a ticket, but it's sort of like this sort of check thing that's happening. And in other interactions, so working on college campuses and seeing different impacts with students of who have to sit on the curb because someone called them in the residence halls versus, who actually freely gets to get away with it. And so much of that, I think, are things I've seen, in terms of the activism that was shown in terms of organizing. A lot of that was, right after the Rodney King, and we didn't call it Know Your Rights workshops back then. But I was president of my youth NAACP chapter, and I would go every year to their annual conference and their youth summit that they would have. And they would have different sessions on activism and using your voice and other kinds of things. And it was there that I really picked up how you can organize something, do a training all on your own, and helping educate people in those scenarios, but then knowing the realities that, like, when we're all, pulled over or something is happening, we're fearful about a certain scenario, all the things that you're trained about and remember, it does go out of your head. And you have to think about how you want to act. Do you want to, be angry with them, about something unfairly? Do you want to be calm? Does it matter? Because you can't even control the reaction, because we've seen evidence after evidence of these things happening where, when everyone was doing all the right things, right, as if there's all the right things to do, we still see these things happening.
You mentioned a couple of times, living in Oregon, growing up there, and because I have kids, I see a lot of Marvel movies, and one thing I'm always fascinated by is by superhero origin stories. How, like, Peter Parker gets bitten by a radioactive spider and becomes Spider-Man, and what they say about the development of the character and where they're coming from. As a sort of a superstar in the world of YA fiction, a budding superstar, what would be your origin story? What's your radioactive spider, the thing that sort of set you on your path when you were younger?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think it was growing up and finally recognizing race, and not only just race, right? There was, you have a parent of a certain identity, you sort of see yourself and sort of recognize there's a color difference, but how that was perceived negatively. And that was really, really early on, like 4th and 5th grade, that I started to recognize that, wow, I'm the only Black kid in my entire class. Wow, I'm the only Black girl in my entire grade. And then you go to middle school, wow, I'm one of 2 in my school. And I think it was being that outsider and feeling like I was different was my origin story, especially in the way of in a community like that. There's a lot of assumptions that can be made. One, you can be an anomaly where they're like very excited. You're not threatening to them because you're only one, right? And they treat you a certain way, or they have these assumptions about things that they see in TV because they've never really even interacted with someone who's Black. And if you can imagine the 80s and 90s, what was on the television, it wasn't as lovely of the actual monolithic large experience that goes beyond these sort of stereotypes. And for me, having been someone that I could have tried to be quiet and just try to adapt as a survival, which is, I think, just as valid thing to do. I was never that person. I was always someone who was, let's start a club. Yeah. Oh, this person said this in this class. I'm going to stop being friends with that person, and we're all going to rally and let's create posters. And I'll say that early Kim Hutchinson, so that was my name at the time, that would be my origin story of being an outsider but still wanting to be very much a part of making change.
I want to talk also about the music you were listening to back then when you were a kid, because I understand that music is something that motivates you, that inspires the work you do. You listen to music while you're writing. And I've also heard you're a big fan of Lauryn Hill. And
Yeah,
I used to
you
work
did
as
all your, you are a journalist. You studied me hard.
well, I used to work as a music critic, and so Lauryn Hill was someone I put her on the cover of Time magazine back when I was a music critic, spent a lot of time with her, huge fan of her work, wish she'd released that second studio album, don't think it's gonna happen anytime soon. And I'm wondering, what about Lauryn Hill really drew you to that album? And how does that album or any other music from the 90s or that's influential to you affect the kind of work that you do now?
Yeah. I think with Lauryn Hill's album, it was the first time that I felt, I mean, there was so many different things. One, that there weren't very many women who were not only rapping, but just really involved in the musical, industry, where you had sort of like triple threat. And she was really one of those sort of first early ones that I saw. But the other big one that I felt like was a real sort of probably that seed early on of writing was, it felt like I was engaged with poetry for the first time. Because if you take her music and you just read her music, it's poetry. And it also sort of really invokes this feeling, like when I can play her album back to back all day long, over and over, and I'll still get like those goosebumps. And when I think about my writing, it's about how to invoke emotion. And she also was doing a lot of stuff on conscious, when she was writing about Zion and her son, and all these other sort of topics about being a woman in the industry. There was so much there, but I felt like it had all those pieces. And a lot of the other early questions that early songs that were kind of coming up in the early 90s was really a rebuttal against, you can't tell me who I am, you can't control me to sort of model ourselves into these sort of perfect families. Because if we think about in the eras of the 80s, it was the Cosby Show. Let's be these sort of very perfect families that look a certain way, and maybe we'll have some sort of respectability politics happening. And the music that was happening, coming out from thinking about in New York and in California, of what was happening in Compton, for example. It was a way for people to actually say, hey, this is what's going on, this is what's happening, fight the power, and telling stories in that way, and really rebelling in a way that just really made a majority of white people, one, terrified, because they couldn't understand where all of this anger was coming from, right? But using your voice in a really powerful way. And I think also taking over culture, really pushing and influencing culture across all races, and all of that was really, I think, inspiring to me. It also was an easy way because my own experience being a young person and feeling like I couldn't write. So I didn't start writing until I was 32 years old. That was the first time that I'd ever, written a creative story. And I have a graduate degree, I have an undergraduate degree, but I promise you, I was running away from writing. Every class I took, I was trying to find a way to get out of it. And music didn't feel like work to me. It didn't feel like work. It felt moving and inspiring. And yeah, that's where a lot of my influences come from.
And it's interesting that you're the hero of your story, Tracy. She's someone who eventually finds her voice in the book as well. And I also find it interesting that you mentioned that you started writing a little later in life. I should pause and say, I'm seeing a lot of questions come in. We're going to get to your questions at the end, so keep sending them in. We'll pick out the most relevant ones and get all into them. So keep on sending in those questions. But back to your writing, the fact that you started writing later, and you actually wrote 2 books before you got around to this third one, which was your breakout debut. What did you learn as a writer, as a person, from writing those first 2 books, and will they ever see the light of day?
I love that question. The first book that I was writing was actually me just telling the story that was in my head. and proving to myself that I actually could tell it from beginning to end and actually do it, at a 300 word story when I've never actually written a story before. And, the main thing that I really, really learned through that process is that I actually could teach myself something new that I was terrified that I wasn't good at. And I was at such a basic level of thinking about writing where, when I was done with my first, the first draft of my novel, like I didn't even have dialogue tags, right? Like it was like I was really learning at the basic level, like how do you actually tell a story? And then I also, I think a lot of my first book was a lot of me. It was based in my town. It had a lot of characters that I could point to people that I knew and growing up. And I would say it's a lot of me. And then when I started working through revisions and working on my second book, it was less about me and more about my life experiences and understanding people and all the, thousands of people that I work with, thousands of students that I've worked with and supported. Then it wasn't about a specific person, but it was about that and learning how to tell a story, at a fast pace, how to tell a compelling narrative that feels still very contemporary in a lot of ways. And I think my second novel will see the light of day. My first novel, no, it will not. Like maybe I'll take the name of a character or like, oh, this sentence is good, but it was pretty raw. It was pretty raw. I mean, I got it cleaned up and, I sent it to agents and got really good feedback, but I think I'm a different kind of writer than I was when I first started. I think my voice is different. My purpose is different. I have a more, I think, refined sense of who I am as an author, rather than I think then was sort of trying to mesh and connect with what I was reading at the time versus now where I trust myself to write things that maybe are different or things like that. So
Maybe you can write a book about a character learning to become a novelist, and that first book can be the book within the book, so you can repurpose some pages that way.
I like your thinking there.
But one thing I'm really interested in is because you talked a bit about some of the sort of artistic things you sort of had to overcome to get to where you are now. But I'm also interested in what other obstacles, what the biggest obstacle you had to overcome on your way to becoming a successful author. Because for me, there's this line by Rilke that I love. I'm paraphrasing that there's this ancient enmity between the great work and daily life, and how 1,000 little things sort of get in your way. Whether it's just a phone call or a text or driving the kids to a soccer practice, just things get in your way of entering, finishing that great work. And I'm wondering, what was your obstacle on the way to creating This Is My America? Was there one big one that you can talk about how you managed to overcome it?
Yeah, you talk about with life and time. I'm going to talk about two because I talk a lot, but I'm going to talk about two things. The first one is I think the biggest challenge that writers have in general, and that's actually finishing that novel, taking an idea from concept to completion. Especially for someone like me who, I not only work full time, I work more than full time. I'm involved in organizations. I'm a graduate advisor to an organization. I'm married. I have 2 kids. My life is very, very compact with a lot of things. And I have a lot of responsibilities in my role that I have, which makes it really stressful. And I'm asked all the time about how I do it. And it's some simple things of, I really recognized very early on that if I was consistent, and if every Saturday and Sunday I took my 3 or 4 hours at my coffee shop or my bookshop and really focused my time and being very productive, I became a very efficient writer. Where there's some writers who they're like, nope, I've got to write every day. And I just didn't have that luxury. I don't get a lot of sleep. So I've challenged with sleep. So I'm not someone who can actually often regularly wake up like at 4 a.m. to write, because I probably only gotten about 4 hours of sleep in general. And so I think that that's the biggest challenge, is to not only write that, but years and years of writing with rejection. Like, so for those of you that don't know much about how difficult it is, one, to get a piece published, or an agent or a publisher, is that you have to basically, you send your heart, your story, right, your query letter and your pages, and it's a long, long process. And every time you think you're almost there because someone asked for 50 pages of the novel, and then you get this sort of blanketed rejection, and then someone asks for a full, and then for 6 months you don't hear a word. You don't hear anything, and that is the biggest obstacle, is pushing through and past that to really get it done. The other obstacle that I think is very important to recognize, for especially for historically underrepresented, although global majority people, is that the industry has not been very welcoming to us. I'll say authors of color, especially, and LGBTQ authors. It has not been a very welcoming place. And while this isn't a full obstacle, this is an example of what I'm about to say, of how many people face that. When I made it through the hurdle, got the book done, pushed it through, got an agent, worked on it in a year, went on submission, and I did get a deal within my first round of submission. But part of that submission, there was an editor who said that they really, really liked my project, but my project would not be bigger than The Hate You Give, and so that they weren't going to buy it. And can you imagine the level of expectation that, as a Black author who's writing on issues tangential, it's not even the same story, but around certain topics, that the bar for me would be movie, collector's editions, being on the New York Times bestsellers list for, I don't know, 200 weeks, 300 weeks. I mean, an amazing accomplishment, but that has to be my, that has to be my sort of expectation with an editor, is that I have to perform at that level. And that shows how disgusting, really, the industry is that standard would be set on, because, books are purchased all the time that sell, maybe even hundreds of copies, and they get an opportunity to do that. And authors of color, we have to have this very large standard that we're going to be a blockbuster right off the gate. And it has to be like right off the gate. And I'm really grateful that the industry has shifted, and the doors have opened a bit more. But how long that will be sustained, I think, is a question that many authors of color, especially queer authors, are asking.
As you told that story, I was just imagining, if book publishers were involved in the Bible, I could imagine them saying, Luke, your gospel isn't going to be as big as Matthew's, so maybe you can go ahead with it. We've already done this. But it's a great story. So I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to turn to the questions that are coming in, because they're a lot of great ones. And I want to talk about your HBO Max deal, which is fantastic. I mean, it's so exciting. That's a golden ticket for an author to publish a successful book and then get it see it being turned into a series. How involved are you going to be in the project? And will you be writing? Will you just be consulting? What will you be doing as this project is brought to the screen?
Yeah, I mean, it's still so surreal, having gone through that, experience. And I'm really, really fortunate that I will have executive producer credit on top of the credit with the book, which allows me an opportunity to do more consulting on site, support with casting, reviewing of pilots, and the production company that I sold my rights to, that's working with HBO Max, did ask me, do I want to write? And at first I was like, oh yes, let me write. No, I'm not going to do that. I don't know how to do that yet. I will one day. It is a goal of mine to really write pilots and screenplays and series casts. And so I've just asked them, I want to see it. and let me provide feedback on it so I can learn how to do it. And so they're at the stages right now where they're working through writing the pilot that's, you know, been close to being greenlit with HBO Max, who's ready and excited for it. So yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Well, I wouldn't begin to offer advice, but I've always found from covering Hollywood that you know, nobody knows anything, and some of the best movies are people who've written scripts for the very first time. Those often crackle with the most excitement because they're bringing new voices to things. So I'm sure you do something great. Maybe the next Citizen Kane if you did it. So I look forward to seeing whatever you do bring to Hollywood. So let's
Yeah.
check to see what some of the questions are here. I'm looking in the chat. Okay, here's one from anonymous attendee. When you write YA, do you write in a different voice than when you write for adult readers, or do you write in your own adult voice and then translate?
You know, when I'm really in my muse and really in my flow, I am the head of the characters. Like that is my goal. You know, there are times that sort of adult writing sort of, you know, that sort of adult piece because I use a certain kind of language and the way I, you know, assess and think about the world. You know, sometimes that sort of floats in a bit and you fix that within revisions, but most of the time I really, when I'm really in the flow of my characters, then I really am writing, you know, in that voice. And if I'm not in a space where I feel like I'm stuck, then I really try to avoid the dialogue. Like if I'm stuck, I really will try not to write the dialogue until I feel that I'm ready to really add the dialogue pieces that I think give a story a certain kind of voice, you know, in particular. But it is hard, you know. I think it's hard translating that, and I do enjoy writing in first person. So I think oftentimes that is harder to sort of get the right language and get the right pace and not have it drag, you know, in a way that then doesn't feel as engaging to read.
Well, that leads me to a follow-up question from me. When you do get stuck, when you do run to writer's block or you can't figure out where to go next, what do you do to unstick yourself?
Yeah, I do a couple of things because I can't write every day, or I choose not to write every day. I always have music associated with all my novels. So there are certain types of songs or certain songs that go with certain scenes that I'll play so that when I know I'm going to work on a project, and if it used to be before pandemic, I would drive to where I needed to write, but now oftentimes I do it at home, is I'll start playing that music and I'll write through playing that music. And that really helps me sort of get ready and have my brain be like, okay, we're writing this story, remember? And it has this kind of feel. And any scene that was very intense, I was listening to in This Is My America, I was listening to musical scores. So, you know, Hans Zimmer, like it had all, you know, John Wick, it had all this sort of intense things happening, and I would write to that. But usually what I really try to do is I know that I'm always on a deadline, or whether it's a self-imposed deadline or external deadline. And so if I feel like I just cannot write that chapter, I skip to the next chapter. And I mark it, and I usually have goals, and usually it's not word count. That's usually not when I do a first draft, it's word count, but when I'm working revisions, it's not word count for me. It really is chapters, like finishing chapters and finishing scenes. And so I'll have a goal like, okay, Saturday, I need to finish these 2 chapters. And Sunday, I need to finish an additional 2 chapters and then work on the half chapter that I know is going to be a struggle for me. And so if I do a trade-off like that Saturday, I'm like, I just can't do this chapter because it's so hard. She has to hang out with mom and it's gonna be so boring and I don't want to write it, but I'm going to skip ahead to the chapter that I'm really interested in writing. But tomorrow I've got to write that scene. And that helps me because it feels like I've earned it. I've negotiated with myself that, you know, it's like, I'll trade you this scene for that scene if you write it. And the last thing I think is actually super helpful for, especially if there's any writers that are there, is I really view when you're writing a draft or writing your story, it's like you're building a sandcastle. And at first it's just dirt, right? You're piling it. you're getting the sand, you're doing it, and then time after time after time, if you're quick enough right before, you got to make sure you're not too close to the tide coming in, you can make a beautiful piece. And that's kind of how I look at the revisions and being stuck, is do a little, garbage is better than nothing, right? You can't edit nothing, but you can edit, you can edit your sloppy sandcastle.
We have a very positive outlook on getting stuck. Maybe we should get you together with George R. R. Martin, see if you can help spur him along.
Help him along, yeah.
Okay, another question you have is, you've had critical and commercial success with your debut novel, and I believe you have another in the works. Are you tempted to quit your day job? We won't tell them, but you can tell us.
It's probably someone from work who's asking that question. I don't know. I think what tempts me is being completely immersed in my writing. I mean, that is such a huge temptation for me. But this industry is so fickle, and fortunately, I love the work that I do. It's hard. I wish I had more time off. Like, let's get that in the contract, more time off. But the industry is really fickle, and it takes a long time. And it's hard to sort of rely. But one day I will write full time.
Another question is, CJ and Kim, I would love to hear either your favorite book or what else you are reading right now, or both. So is it something you're reading right now you can tell us about, or something about one of your favorite books?
Oh gosh, I have so many. Honestly, go ahead.
I can kick it off while you think.
Yes, please do.
I just finished a book that I'm bursting the telephone about 30 years or 50 years too late. I'd never read Giovanni's Room. I read when I was a kid, and maybe I only sort of flipped through it. And I finally listened to the audiobook version, and I was just struck, there's some problematic things in it, but I was just struck how far ahead of his time James Baldwin was. Maybe I shouldn't be surprised. I mean, anyone who saw that documentary, I'm Not Your Negro, knows, what an incredible guy James Baldwin was, and that his works, is really sort of forward leaning. But that book, Giovanni's Room, which is about a young white man in Paris who's sort of discovering his sexuality, and he explores sort of gay life in Paris at the time, is really a fascinating book, and it's worth checking out. It's very short, but I thought it was just really well written and very interesting. I'm surprised it's not a movie myself, but so you can go now that you've had time to think. Any books you've read lately that
and I'll just say I co-sign. I think if you can go back to anything of James Baldwin and even read it again, because it's something I haven't read in a really long time, and looking at it now, there's a different perspective. He was definitely ahead of his time. I'm actually listening to a lot of audiobooks because I've been heavy online edits and deadlines, and so I've been listening to adult thriller books lately. Ruth Ware is one. The Turn of the Key was one I finished recently. Early Departures by Justin Reynolds is one I'm rereading again. He's another young adult author that I really, really enjoy. There was several different books I'm looking at potentially blurbing that I can't say much about, but there is one coming out that I really, really enjoyed. It's by Jazz Hammonds, called We Deserve Monuments. It's coming out this fall. I really, really love that book. Yeah, there's so many, but my brain is so hard. I can't even say, there's too many.
Okay. And another question that came in. I'm glad someone asked this, because this was in my list of questions to talk about too. And obviously there's been a lot of talk about book banning lately, and the characters in your book have roots in Texas, and that's where a lot of the book banning is going on. And a question that came in from Laura Zaro Kopinski is, given what's been going on nationally, have you had to deal with people trying to ban This Is My America? Now, I, for one, would love to have someone ban my book, just so I could go out in there and talk about it. So please, if you're out there, please ban my book, 0 O'Clock. Kids should not get their hands on that book. But how do you feel about book banning?
I'm gonna put a resource in the chat from my publisher that talks a lot about book banning. I don't know if there's any students or educators, but there's a lot of resources that I think are helpful on how to mitigate these issues. But you know, my book has been challenged and banned, and it's interesting because my book is in Texas. I've seen it be challenged and questioned. I've had some teachers in Texas who had reached out to me because they wanted me to make a visit, share that they are worried that if they have a visitor that it might end up impacting their curriculum, and they don't want the book to sort of be, you know, focused in that way. But it's also interesting that I'm a spot Texas spot book for 2020. So the high schools around the state chose my book as a top book to read. And so it's really interesting, this sort of fight that's occurring. The most prominent where I've been tagged in articles is in Pennsylvania, in Bucks County, where my book and Evie Zaboa's book were pulled and questioned, and there's a big fight happening in Bucks County. But the way I am as a writer and how I came to writing, it's always been about my purpose and calling and something else driving, sort of feeling like I'm influenced at a sort of higher level about my work. And the thing that I find fascinating about Bucks County, and why that happens to be the one that's the most prominent pushing against my book, is the fact that the book that was supposed to come out this year, that I decided to halt so I could write my other book, Invisible Sun. And I've written this book, and I went back and forth on this book because this book is it's a YA historical, and I wanted to really get it right because I did a lot of research and looking at Levittown, which is the first known really American suburbia towns that were built that had explicit anti-Black laws, where you actually could not live in these communities. And it really was where our white picket fence, and right after the GA bill, where lots of these houses were bent. And I decided when I did my first draft that I was going to place it in Long Island, where Levittown, what one of the Levittown sites is, because I found it really interesting how much that area has changed. I felt like that would be sort of a good place to be. I didn't choose Levittown in Bucks County originally. And now I realize that no, my calling, my purpose, the reason why I probably should have held that book was I was supposed to find out that Bucks County wanted to ban me. And so I will be working on this book, redoing my research, but a lot of my research dealt with the racism that happened with a family that you can look up, the Myers family, MYERS, who were harassed and had thousands of people in front of their houses. A Black family moved into Bucks County and Levittown. And that seems most appropriate for me to write about the history in this country and how we are not far from it. So that's my long-winded way of saying I've got something for them. I've got something for them.
Great. Well, and my last question sort of jumps off of that. You talked a bit about what your purpose is in writing your books. I want to know what kind of purpose you want to give to your readers. What's the call to action you hope they take away when they read This Is My America?
Yeah, you know, for me, that book is all about call to action. It's embedded in the letters that Tracy writes, Know Your Rights workshops, her activities, the resources at the end. And my hope is that when readers get to the last page, they are so awakened, shaken, empowered, that they continue to think not only about the book, but about their community. That's my call to action. And that could look in a lot of different ways. They hand the book to someone else, they see an issue in their school and they want to talk about it. They decide they want to write letters about something that they're passionate about, that they start to organize, that they start to see themselves in wanting to be dean. Do you want to be dean in this story, or do you want to be his parents? in the story? Do you want to be Beverly, the police officer, or do you want to be, another officer? Who do you want to be in the story? Who represents you? Who do you want to model yourself for? And that's my call to action.
Well, that's great. I think that's a good place for us to end this. I want to thank you for joining me with this talk, joining with me for this talk. I want to thank the festival for hosting it. And I hope everyone runs out there and gets, if you haven't already, This Is My America, and maybe sign up for HBO so you can watch the series when it comes on too. And why not? So thanks a lot.
Absolutely. This was an amazing conversation. We hope to see you back again. Thank you so much, Kim. Thank you so much, CJ, and everyone. Have a great night. Take care.
Good night, everyone.